the Selwyn webinar, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Andrew Marr, journalist and broadcaster and presenter for many years at the BBC, and he's now gone off to the New Statesman, where he's political editor and writing interesting cover stories, and he's also about to start a show on LBC. So we will be hearing quite a bit more from Andrew, and he is, I think, just one of the best political observers there is. So we're very lucky to have him with us for about 40 minutes this morning. And the way it will work is I will interview Andrew for about 15 minutes maybe, and you're very welcome to put your questions in via the chat function. So put questions in via chat and I'll then put them to Andrew. So Andrew, the reason it's particularly good to talk to you this morning is we are in the most interesting state of British politics again.
Sure.
And you've been writing in the New Statesman about how bad it is for Johnson and the anger in the country and the fury there is among Conservative MPs. And we've now got a police investigation and all sorts of things going on. Now, you can relatively easily get a motion of no confidence in a Prime Minister by 54 Tory MPs doing that. Why haven't they?
Well, very interesting question, Roger. And actually, over the last couple of days, I've been talking to friends of mine in the Conservative Party who have decided that he has to go, but who have not yet sent in letters. And they both said versions of the same thing, which is they think that last week, or the week that's now ending, Boris Johnson would win, probably quite clearly a vote of no confidence. He'd probably have 100 or so MPs voting against him, but he's hanging on, either through the payroll vote or offers of jobs or gongs or policy changes, or whatever it might be, to enough to hang on. And then he would just declare victory and carry on. What they think is that we're now into a parliamentary recess, which lasts for another 10 days or so. During that time, we will probably get the full version of Sue Gray's report. And in a very, very important intervention at PMQs, Johnson has finally agreed unequivocally that he will publish the whole thing immediately. And we'll get the Metropolitan Police coming to their conclusion, which may or may not mean fixed penalty notice fines for the Prime Minister. And those two things would tip the balance, they think. That plus a bit of marinading in the company of irate constituents, if they're not on the ski slopes, that would, as it were, tip them over. So they think tactically is better to wait until after this recess. I have to say, if the votes don't go in and we don't get a contest triggered by the end of this month, then I think the rebel leaders themselves have a credibility question to answer.
It may sound a slightly paradoxical question, but let's talk a bit about Boris Johnson as a success. And the fact is that he came to prominence probably almost 20 years ago as a backbencher, and he's been at the top of politics or close to it ever since. And all the people who were there when he came in, Cameron and Brown and Blair and everybody else, long gone by the wayside. And he hasn't lost a single election he has contested. Why is he so successful in both longevity and having made it Prime Minister?
Yesterday, I was doing an event at my old college, Trinity Hall, with the historian Claire Jackson, and we were talking about the early modern period and the importance then of the character and the temperament of the various monarchs leading the countries. And that was, politics was all about character and temperament. And I thought, actually, do you know what? It's beginning to feel that way again, because all I can say about Johnson, and I've known him, I guess, for about 30 years, is that he is totally unlike anybody else. There's nobody else at the top of politics I can think of who, if it walked into your room right now, a smile of pleasure would come on your face, even now probably, and you think this is going to be fun. He has a kind of mesmeric, charismatic, no doubt populist appeal that people on the left, and particularly Remainers and so on, completely misunderstand. He just reaches the parts that other politicians can't get to. I was talking to one of the very senior shadow cabinet ministers close to Keir Starmer, and I said to her, look, you're going to get rid of, you probably want to hang on to Boris Johnson for as long as possible because he's so unpopular with Partygate and the lies and so forth that he must be a great recruiter for you. And she said, Andrew, absolutely not. You're completely wrong. Boris Johnson is the only Tory politician who can reach people in my part of the world. She's from the north. You can already gather who she is. Anyway, politician in my part of the world, he just reaches. They don't think he's a Tory. They think he's one-off. They think he's unique. and the disheveled sort of chaos of him, it just reminds them of various members of their own families, and a smile comes on their faces. He is a campaigner unlike anybody else. Unfortunately for the rest of us, he's also a prime minister unlike anybody else.
I was in Yorkshire in September. And of course, when you've been in Cambridge and in the bubble, and particularly through coronavirus, you live with a lot of people who don't get Boris Johnson. And I was very struck in Yorkshire by people who do get Boris Johnson in exactly the way you described. And of course, you can talk about his lies and his inexactitudes of the truth. For them, one of the big things is that when the establishment was going to deny them Brexit, he delivered it. So actually, they see in that a contract that he honoured.
Absolutely, and I think Brexit is a truism. It's banal, maybe, but it's true. That Brexit has changed everything. Brexit was the thing that brought him to prominence. That was the issue which took him to the top of the Conservative Party. That was the issue which allowed his absolutely combative and rule-breaking instincts freest play when he was taken to the Supreme Court and the prorogation of Parliament and all of that. Brexit, without Brexit, I don't think we would necessarily have had a Boris Johnson premiership, because, as it were, the old Conservative establishment, the Camerons and the Osbornes and so forth, would have found ways of keeping him out. He needed something really, really big to get him jemmied right to the top. Brexit, first of all, the referendum, and then the election of 2019, which followed it, was really the Brexit referendum part 2, was essential to the story of Boris Johnson.
And would you say, a number of people said that what is striking about Johnson is that he has very thin levels of loyalty in the Conservative Party. And that was really because people thought they would win their seats if he was leader. But there aren't Johnsonites in the way that there were Thatcherites or supporters of Cameron and his modernisation. So he's got a very transactional relationship with the Conservative Party.
He does. I've been thinking about a rather strange parallel, Roger, with Tony Blair, because Blair reached parts of small c conservative Middle England that Labour couldn't otherwise reach. You know, he made a big deal of crime. He talked a lot about tougher education. He talked about not wanting to tax the rich and so forth in ways that Labour had traditionally done. And he reached way out into conservative Middle England. And on the back of that, he won 3 stonking election victories. And the only slight problem was that the Labour Party staggered out of that period, unsure about who it any longer was, in a real sort of state of kind of confusion about its own identity. And that led to Corbynism and everything that's happened since. And I slightly wonder if Johnson has done the same thing to the Tory party, because reaching deep into, as it were, the previously Labour North and Midlands of England, he has won a huge election victory, those 80 seats, but he has acquired millions and millions of previously Labour voting supporters who want higher public spending, who wouldn't tolerate any cuts to pensions or to welfare, and also want big grand projets, whether rail or whatever. And so he's committed himself to high public spending. And of course, this is the highest spending government since the 1950s, highest taxing government since the 1950s in proportional terms. And I think there's an awful lot of people I talked to in the Conservative Party who are looking in the mirror and saying, who are we? We don't know who we are anymore. Are we a high-spending sort of populist party for working class voters in the North? Are we a Thatcherite party? What kind of party are we? And I'm beginning to see the same sort of existential confusion, if you like, in the Conservative Party that we saw after Blair in the Labour Party, or during and after Blair in the Labour Party.
Just reminders to people that do send in questions via chat. We've got a couple coming in already, and I'll come to the questions on chat in 5 or 6 minutes. Andrew, there's a presenter at the BBC, you may be able to guess who I'm talking about, who came to Selwyn just before Christmas and said to me, Boris is finished, it's all over, it's gone. And that has been a view from the Westminster chattering classes since the end of last year. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that he will be in office by the end of this year?
Broadly speaking, I do agree with it. But I'm going through a sort of very personal sort of puzzle over this. On the one hand, talking to Tories And looking at his situation inside the party, I find it very hard to see how he carries on as an effective prime minister for long. If you look at the big problems coming up for the country, the biggest one being the cost of living and energy price issue, the Treasury is totally dominant on that. Rishi Sunak has him over a barrel, and Number 10's grip over all of economic policy has gone almost completely. That's a very difficult situation for a prime minister to be in. Tony Blair survived it for quite a long time, but it's still very difficult. Then you think about, will the UK hang together? Nicola Sturgeon is only days, maybe weeks away from announcing the details of her Indy Ref 2. And Johnson, in that situation, we shouldn't forget, has lost the entire Conservative Party in Scotland. If you look to Ireland, where Sinn Féin are likely to win in May, in the elections there in May, probably Sinn Féin, possibly even with the Alliance Party as their constitutional partner, you will have a completely different situation in Ireland. Talk again of a border poll, and yet Johnson's weakness and the inability of Liz Truss to do a new deal on the protocol means that he's completely paralyzed in that direction, in ineffective politics as well. He can't get through probably radical, exciting new policies he's dreamed up in the Conservative Party in Parliament at the moment. In every direction, he seems to be stymied. So I think I look at all of that and I think, no. So obviously, and then you talk to all the Tory MPs, and there's something quite close to loathing for Boris Johnson over the party. The party thing is very easy to underestimate, even now. And I talk to lots of Tory MPs who are on the right of the party, by the way, as well as the left of the party, and they just say, we just cannot go on, however bloody, however difficult, we just have to get rid of this guy. And I absorb all of that, and then I kind of look at Boris Johnson, and I look at Rishi Sunak and the rest of them, and I think, really, have they got what it takes to get rid of this guy if he's absolutely determined what to go? So intellectually, I think he's finished. Emotionally, I wonder if I'm wrong.
Okay, I'm going to bring a couple of questions in which are actually on this kind of theme. Brian Hornsby, who's an alumnus, you mentioned voters who brought Johnson to power in 2019. How loyal do you think those voters would be if there was an election now, which is really what you were just saying? Would they be?
Well, that's a hard one. I think Labour would win a lot of seats if there's an election now. They've managed to maintain a pretty healthy 8 to 10 points in the polls now for quite a while. If an election happened now, Partygate would still be fresh in people's minds. I think the situation will be very different in 1 or 2 years' time. Then it is, you used the word transactional just now, Roger, and I think if the government is seen to be responsible for a really painful, we shouldn't talk about a cost of living crisis, it's a can't pay my bills crisis coming to millions of families quite shortly. And I think then he just loses an awful lot of those seats almost immediately on that. They like him, but they'll be they'll feel very cross and they'll feel very let down. It is a perfect moment for Labour in that sense. Though, of course, none of these issues really help Labour long term, because the truth is we haven't got a strong enough economy, we haven't got a productive enough economy to give us all the things that we think as a society we need and deserve.
I just want to touch on Labour because Labour seem now, having had the Corbyn experience, to be going back to being a very conventional opposition, rather middle of the road. Wes Streeting, a Selwyn alumnus who has really become a star in recent weeks. And they just seem to be taking there's not the ideological position there was under Corbyn. So is that the way they see as being successful and not possibly defining themselves too much?
I think probably if he was talking candidly, Keir Starmer would say, look, Labour comes into power in different kinds of situations historically, but very often is in a situation where the Conservatives are thought to have screwed things up. Whether there's been a problem in the war or whatever it might be, there's a sense of crisis, and we don't very often come to power as the really radical, shake everything up, change everything, unsettle everything party. And actually, our historic job, maybe we're the people who come in after the party and clear up the mess. We're the cleaners after the Bullingdon Club has been through the rooms, as it were. And in the sense, that's maybe what people want. They want a calmer, more conventional kind of government, which starts to get the Metropolitan Police sorted out, which starts to get the problem over so-called smart highways sorted out, which gets those sort of nuts and bolts things mended. We're a mending party. We're a cleaning, mending, and reconstruction party, and that's actually what the country now wants.
Now, Andrew, you were the interviewer who put the question to Keir Starmer at the start of the Labour Party conference, quote, "Is someone who thinks only women have a cervix welcome in the Labour Party?" I think it's fair to say that Keir Starmer rather equivocated and wasn't very clear in that answer. Do you think that Labour do have a problem about being a party associated with now the middle chattering classes and the emerging identity politics? And that is something where the Conservatives can still have a position which they see as more popular?
I think if the Conservatives win the next election, identity politics will be part of the reason. I think the real danger for Labour is getting themselves not only talking, but engaged in a vicious internecine feud inside the party over issues which, frankly, most of the country don't really consider important at all. It's less which side of the argument you take on the trans versus turf war, as it were, and more that they shouldn't be talking about it at all. This is not central. They should be talking about the living standards of ordinary British people, the security of ordinary British people, the threat from Russia at the moment, and those things, not about, I think it's a hugely attractive distraction imported into this country in many cases from American academia and spread through social media. And it's a very, very dangerous thing for the Labour Party to get involved in. It gives interviewers like me an absolutely easy hit, as I had with him and with Ed Davey. But if I was giving candid advice, just shut up about the whole subject.
Okay, I'm going to keep bringing some questions in, though I think you and I could talk all day. Heloise Messervy-Whiting asks, do you think that the party scandal and the Sue Gray Met Police investigation marks a new low for public trust, or that because of Johnson's charm and appeal and the continual erosion of trust in public officials in recent years, he'll be able to survive? And if he does, do you think the concept of trust in politicians really has any relevance anymore?
I think it does represent a moment, put it that way, a new low moment. I had a very strange experience sitting in a memorial service. I wrote about it for Jack Dromey, who's married to Harriet Harman, a great trade unionist and Irish working class trade unionist, and a thoroughly good guy. And I realized when there was a long kind of religious bit, and I wasn't concentrating perhaps as much as I ought to have done, that actually I buried my father outside with another 5 people in the wind, in a kirkyard in Scotland, outside the church, which was bolted and locked, where he had worshipped and where he'd been involved for 56 years. And in that very same week, the big first Downing Street party was going on. And I just felt a personal sense of outrage, anger, hurt, etc. Now, that doesn't really matter. That's just my story. But I think millions and millions of people had similar or parallel and many often worse stories to tell. And therefore, I think Partygate is one of those very, very rare political events in which a relatively minor set of events at the heart of government completely emotionally connects to millions of people, regardless of their political views or allegiances or alliances. They just go straight to the heart of how many people experience a particularly painful and harrowing slice of our national history. That kind of direct connection, that electrical cable connecting the events in Downing Street to the lives of millions of people, makes it different. And that's why I think a lot of Tory MPs over this recess are going to be wondering whether, in the words of one of them, to practice the fine art of calligraphy.
I'm sure you're right about the connection with millions of people across the country. And can I ask you, I mean, you've followed politics for decades and you've been very close to Downing Street and in and out there all the time, and you were BBC political editor. Well, were you surprised by Partygate, just the scale of it and the complete breaking of the rules?
You know, at one level, one has to show a bit of human empathy for everybody, including, no doubt, civil servants who've been working sort of 15-hour days, who are knackered. Someone comes into your office and says, glass of wine, you know, you've been working really, really hard. Of course, naturally, that's what they want to do. But I am completely bewildered that an organization stuffed with senior civil servants with legal training, which had itself actually drafted, laid out and put through Parliament the rules that they were now breaking, that nobody was saying, for goodness sake, we just can't do this. Because all over the country, people were saying that, we can't do this. Oh no, I better not do this. Let's have some friends around it. Oh no, we can't. Oh no, we can't. The fact that nobody in number 10 was saying, no, we can't, no, we can't. Well, some were. Dominic Cummings, as he was, I find utterly baffling.
And it was civil servants, of course, as well as political officials.
But we both know, whether it's a Cambridge college or whether it's a Whitehall department, it all goes to the top. It all comes from the top. If the guy at the top is heedless of rules, as Boris Johnson seems to have been, and doesn't care, and is suggesting we should just have a laugh and break the rules anyway, that percolates to everybody very, very quickly.
Okay, I just encourage students to send questions in, because at the moment they're coming from many of our distinguished alumni. So we'd like a few student questions as well. I mean, related to what you were talking about the quality of people, Stephen Tromans, who is alumnus and a lawyer, says the quality of individuals generally achieving high office seems currently abysmally low. What can be done about this? Anything?
Well, I would throw it back and ask your alumnus whether he would want to stand for Parliament under these circumstances. I think an awful lot of sane people look at the abuse, look at the pressure and all the rest of it. And the people who want to do something good, they might say, no, I'm going to go and work for a charity instead. I'm going to earn a good living here or there and then do something worthwhile for it. That's how I'll do the good bit. But I'm not going to throw myself into politics because it's just become an absolute nest of vipers. I'm not going to put my family through it. I was talking to one colleague about, this is not directly politics, but I think it's connected, about who's going to take over from Laura Kuenssberg at the BBC. And Laura allegedly said that one of her colleagues who'd been tipped for it isn't going to go for it because she's not mad. She knows what it's like. It's just, and she's described herself, I'm a sort of boiled frog, because the water's got hotter and hotter and hotter in terms of social media abuse during her time. But to jump into that now, you'd have to be pretty odd to really want to do that. And I think if that's the case for journalists, it's the case even more so for people going into politics directly. And so, yeah, I mean, I can look back nostalgically when I first came to the House of Commons, and you looked at the Tory benches and they were full of people who'd run their own businesses or founded businesses or worked high up in businesses, who knew what a balance sheet was, who'd had to fire people, who'd had to stay up all night worrying about loans and all the rest of it, who knew the real world in that sense. And the Labour Party benches were full of people who had literally been sheet metal workers or miners, or had done really tough, gritty jobs and had all the experience that came from that. And now on both sides, you get people who leave, expensive educations and go straight into Conservative central offices, advisors or aides or SPADs. You get people who go into academia and then go straight into the Labour Party or go into the trade unions as researchers and become Labour MPs. It's a much thinner kind of texture of experience and knowledge. But I do think if you want the best people, we have to kind of find ways to make politics a little bit less relentlessly aggressive.
There's someone called DXW who sent a cryptic message saying, perhaps that means I'm not sane. So I'm not quite sure what role he or she is in, but we note that anyway. A question from a technical question away from Chris Dobson, who's one of our distinguished alumni, which is, why do you think that the Metropolitan Police is not being investigated for failing to stop the parties? And of course, you, as I say, someone going in and out of Downing Street, everyone knew every time you were going in and out. And how do you have 100 people in a garden with wine and the police just watching it?
Well, of course, Sadiq Khan has just pushed out Cressida Dick, as Boris Johnson, when he was mayor of London, pushed out one of her predecessors, Ian Blair. But I have to say, I think it's very strange. I find it very odd. I don't understand exactly why the Met Police didn't investigate earlier on. They knew what was going on. They must have known what was going on. And there was certainly sent evidence. And yet, first of all, they said we don't have enough evidence. Then they said we don't investigate retrospective incidents, which would kind of put the point of most of the police, make them completely pointless. So no, I don't understand it. I think it's very, very odd. And someday, some journalist somewhere is going to get to the bottom of this.
DXW has just revealed himself. It is actually Lord Wilson, David Wilson, who's Justice Minister
right.
in the House of Lords and is SE 1987. So I now understand the reference. So he is actually a serving minister at the moment. So you have a particularly distinguished audience today, and I just keep encouraging people to ask questions and students too. Can I ask a question which comes from our bursar, actually, who I don't think you'll mind me saying is a former Liberal Democrat candidate for Wimbledon and a former councillor in Richmond, where I still live in London and you used to live, Andrew. And he asked a question which is quite politically astute about the importance of the 2019 election is obvious in Boris Johnson's prominence, but how important was the 2017 election, by which I assume he means Theresa May coming with an honest manifesto and going into it with an enormous lead and then throwing it all away. So how much did that folk memory affect the way Johnson drove things in 2019?
Here's a sort of slightly oblique answer. Nikki da Costa, who was head of legislative affairs at Number 10 under Boris Johnson, wrote a really interesting thread recently where she said, what happens when a prime minister loses authority is that every other part of Whitehall ceases to automatically do what they want. They think, okay, here in the paperclips department, we can look after our own paperclips. We're not going to hear the prime minister telling us what to do. So they just push back prime ministerial orders or suggestions or paperwork all the time. And so the prime minister then has to work harder to get what he or she wants to happen. And that takes longer, and the pushback comes back again. And bit by bit, the entire system grinds to a halt because the prime minister's authority has been undermined at Westminster. Now, what happened in the 2017 election was that happened to Theresa May. She went into that election as a very commanding figure. Her version of Brexit was beginning to be understood properly. It was being thrashed out, negotiated, and she emerged out of it after a catastrophic election campaign run by Nick Timothy, very, very bright guy who's now lecturing this government about how to do things better, with really diminished authority. And I think her lack of authority meant that there was no possibility of doing, as it were, the soft Brexit that a lot of people had voted for, and that only left the hard Brexit. And therefore, yes, of course, that all election campaigns have an effect, but that election campaign was part of the defeat of, if you like, the centre or the centre-right of the Conservative Party or the moderates over Brexit, and made everything that's happened since inevitable, or much likelier anyway.
Okay, another piece of political history question from Ian Gaunt. Why did Michael Gove apparently change his mind about Boris Johnson's capacity to be leader of the Conservative Party and agree to serve under him when he was not prepared to act as his campaign manager, and of course famously pulled the rug from under the Johnson campaign in 2016, I think it was, yeah.
Stabbed him in the front, yes. Yeah. Ambition is a great thing, of course. But I think there's always been a sort of underlying deal between the two of them, which works for both, which is that Michael Gove, very, very bright guy and all the rest of it, he's got nothing like the popular appeal of Boris Johnson. Michael Gove could not have charged around the country and won the Brexit referendum by himself. Michael Gove could not have thrown himself into the 2019 election and emerged as a dominant figure. Boris Johnson only could do those things. And at the same time, Boris Johnson knows fine well that he's not very, very good at the detail, not even at the tactical thinking, but often at the strategic stuff as well. He needs somebody to effectively run things for him. He did in City Hall for a long time, and he does in Number 10. And Michael Gove is the hyperactive, very, very bright, very capable minister who can deliver lots of things for Boris Johnson. He was delivering in education, and he's meant to be delivering in levelling up. We'll see what happens. But certainly he produced that white paper that was not sort of dumped on by everybody, whatever you think of it. And he will be endlessly coming up with wheezes for cities in the north. In other words, he's a doer, so he suits Boris Johnson. He's a doer who no longer threatens Boris Johnson in any serious way, so he particularly suits Boris Johnson. And I think, and in return, he gets lots of interesting and powerful jobs from Boris Johnson. It's the kind of relationship that works well both ways.
Bella Cross, who's our JCR president. What do you think can be done to make politics less relentless, and who's responsible for the fact it is so intense?
Gosh, well, we all are. You could close down all of social media and most newspapers, and that would help. But I don't propose that or suggest it would be a terrible thing. You're not, in other words, you're not going to change the media environment short term. I actually think that different kinds of leadership would have a big effect. I think a world where we had, shall we say, Jeremy Hunt or even Sajid Javid or Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister would feel very quickly very different. You don't have to run politics as a series of kind of gang fights between different factions. You can have political leaders who are quick to forgive and don't hold grudges, and maybe less vivid language. In other words, a slightly duller politics is not very far away from us, I think. In terms of the lives of MPs, I don't really have any useful suggestions. I do think they probably require even more expensive support in constituencies in terms of ensuring that they are getting a good flow of people through their offices. I think it's very, very hard for them a lot of the time. I don't have any, as you can hear, I don't really have any great answers to that. It's a very good question, but the world is full of good questions for which there are no available good answers. In my experience.
And Andrew, you mentioned earlier Scotland, and it's something obviously as a Scot you've written about a lot and have a keen interest in. For people who haven't been following it in enormous detail, there was of course the, if you like, the emotional sense of Scotland's nationhood being asserted. But in the past week or two, the SNP are getting into some tangles on pensions and the question of, would the UK government still have a responsibility to Scottish pensions? There are big issues about the EU and maybe joining the euro. And of course, we've now seen in Northern Ireland the border question, which has been enormously contentious in Northern Ireland and would become an issue at Gretna or Berwick or around the place. Do you think that the intellectual case for nationalism is now a bit more challenging than it was maybe 5 years ago?
Well, it should have been challenging 5 years ago because essentially the arguments haven't changed. And what happened 5 years ago is, I think that the first Scottish referendum, was the first time pre-Brexit that people realised that voters do not necessarily listen intently to coherent economic or other arguments. They vote with their guts, they vote with their instincts and their emotions. And looking at the polling in Scotland, there is, as voters get younger, they get more passionate about independence. There is a really strong emotional push for independence in Scotland, and the numbers are there. The question is whether the detailed arguments can restrain people. Now, I think that they should be a restraint. I think that if you think of a Scotland which would be in the EU, there would have to be a proper land border with England. Goods would have to be checked in both directions. Now, 60% or so of Scotland's exports don't go anywhere but England. They go to England. So that would have a huge, huge and quite quick impact on the Scottish economy. The Scottish economy has a relatively slender tax base, and yet better off Scots who didn't want to pay higher income taxes would be it's very easy to move to Northumberland and still be in touch with people you want to be in touch with, or Cumbria. So there's a real problem for the SNP there. You mentioned the pensions issue. By the way, I think pensions is going to be one of the really, really big issues at the next general election all across the UK, and is being under-discussed and under-reported at the moment. But the Scottish proposition, which appears to be that there is somehow a great big pension pot sitting there, which Scots have been paying into all their dogged and worthy lives, and that therefore, after independence, they would be able to take money out of what had been the British pot, and the British government would carry on paying pensions, is just wrong. That's not how pensions work. We're all paying right now for today's pensioners through our national insurance and our taxation. And therefore, after independence, there would be no liability whatever of the British government to pay for Scottish pensions. Nicola Sturgeon used to understand this. She more or less said that herself and said, no, of course, that would be the responsibility of the new Scottish government in the new Scotland. Now, whether she thinks that perhaps it's such a toxic issue that she has to try and sort of smother it with upbeat nationalist verbiage, I don't know, but it's a real problem. And I think it's a good example of a misstep, if I can put it that way, by a Scottish politician that isn't going to be forgotten for a long time to come.
We'll go, I've still got time for a couple more questions, but we're going to finish in about 5 minutes. And another very big theme from Michael Hennessy. How far do you think that any Conservative leadership upheaval and contest could be influenced by Ukraine and Russia?
So I think that the British government, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, are doing exactly the right thing at the moment on this issue. In other words, Britain is being very, very tough at a time when the EU, frankly, as a defense organization, not that it is one, but it's just a great big jelly when it's being prodded by Vladimir Putin. The Germans in particular, very, very appeasing for reasons of their own. Ukraine I don't think this is about Ukraine. I think this is about Poland, it's about the Baltic states, and it's about pushing back to the borders of the old Soviet Union and the final defeat of NATO. And if you think of NATO and look at where Washington is spending its time and attention, which is the South China Sea, any organization which is called the North Atlantic anything now begins to seem a bit nostalgic and historic. And I think Putin understands this. He has got the jump on us in terms of the missile gap in his hypersonic missiles for the next 2 or 3 years. So this is his moment. It's a profoundly dangerous moment. And I think, it ought to be something that all MPs, Tory or otherwise, should be thinking about during the recess, and how we should, we're not very well armed. We're not very potent in the world as we used to be, but we have to take a big role in this. We have to try to be the bridge between Washington and the European NATO states in some old-fashioned way. There are, of course, other contenders who would do very well in this situation as well. Jeremy Hunt, I've mentioned before, he was Foreign Secretary. He knows about dealing with the Russians, and he's an experienced, equable, serious guy. Tom Tugendhat, who's not going to win, but has thrown his hat in the air even before there's a contest, of course, is very, very experienced, very hawkish on this. So I think it is going to be an issue. If you're a real cynic, you can say that sort of Vladimir Putin's close to saving Boris Johnson's job, because while it's such a crisis at the moment, who would want to change their prime minister? The truth is perhaps that there are people out there who do the job better than Boris Johnson.
Andrew, we've covered a huge amount of ground, and it's been incredibly interesting. I want to ask a final question about you, really. And of course, you were in the BBC for around about 20 years. You're now able to write what you want in a New Statesman, presumably say what you want on LBC. Is that a liberating moment for you? Candidly,
I feel 10 years younger than I did a few months ago. I love the BBC. I revere the BBC. I'm never going to be one of those people where you pick up the Daily Mail and there's ex-BBC journalist attacks the BBC. I'm not going to do that ever. But the truth is, while I completely understand and approve of the impartiality guidelines, after 21 years of being really interested in, the fate of the country, to put it pompously, I find it increasingly oppressive to self-censor in a nuanced but perpetual way. And I think the last couple of years at the BBC, I was mildly depressed because I just find it very, very hard keeping my mouth shut. I was trying to kind of swallow, digest, and get rid of my opinions even before I'd formed them for quite a while. And that's quite difficult. So I just feel much, much happier and much, much younger. And that is not an anti-BBC comment in any way at all. Just a personal thing.
Okay, well, you look young and vigorous on the Zoom call. So listen, thank you so much for that. It was incredibly interesting. And you have been a visitor to Selwyn, of course, in the past. We hope you'll come back and see us again.
I certainly will. I certainly will.
Good. Well, thank you hugely. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. The next of our webinars is, I think, 2 weeks today with Robert Harris talking about Munich, the Edge of War. So do join us for that. That'll be 6 o'clock, and keep an eye on our social media and other web forums where we tell you what's going on. And Andrew, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Roger.
See you again soon.
Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye.